You are listening to the IFH Podcast Network. For more amazing filmmaking and screenwriting podcasts, just go to ifhpodcastnetwork.com.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast, episode number 103. Talent is cheaper than table salt. What separates the talented individual from the successful one is a lot of hard work. Stephen King.
Broadcasting from a dark, windowless room in Hollywood when we really should be working on that next draft. It's the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast, showing you the craft and business of screenwriting while teaching you how to make your screenplay bulletproof. And here's your host, Alex Ferrari.
Welcome to another episode of the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast. I am your humble host, Alex Ferrari. Now, today's show is sponsored by Bulletproof Script Coverage. Now, unlike other script coverage services, Bulletproof Script Coverage actually focuses on the kind of project you are and the goals of the project you are. So we actually break it down by three categories: micro budget, indie film market, and studio film. There's no reason to get coverage from a reader that's used to reading tentpole movies when your movie's going to be done for $100,000. And we wanted to focus on that at Bulletproof Script Coverage. Our readers have worked with Marvel Studios, CAA, WME, NBC, HBO, Disney, Scott Free, Warner Brothers, The Blacklist, and many, many more. So if you need your screenplay or TV script covered by professional readers, head on over to covermyscreenplay.com. And today's show is also sponsored by the Hart Chart Screenwriting Masterclass, taught by legendary screenwriter James V. Hart, the writer of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Hook, and Contact, to name a few. His unique story mapping system will teach you how to get your script ready for production and the marketplace. To gain instant access, head over to bulletproofscreenwriting.tv/Hart Chart. That's HART chart. Now, guys, have you ever wondered what it takes to get a lit manager in Hollywood? Well, today's guest is going to shine a light on how you should approach a literary manager. His name is John Zaozirny, and his clients' scripts have been set up at Warner Brothers, Paramount, Fox, Lionsgate, New Lines, Focus Features, Fox 2000, Sony, Universal, and many, many more. His clients have also been at the top of the industry-leading Blacklist multiple times. John definitely knows how to spot screenwriting talent. Now, John and I discussed the raw truth about the film business, what he's looking for in a client, how screenwriters should approach a manager, and he also does some Hollywood myth busting as well. If you're looking for representation in the film industry, this is a must listen to conversation. So without any further ado, please enjoy my conversation with John Zaozirny. I'd like to welcome to the show John Zaozirny. How are you doing, John?
I'm doing all right, thank you.
Thank you so much for being on the show, man. I appreciate it. How is the world treating you?
It's a crazy time right now. I'm not sure when this will be coming out, but right now it's prior to the inauguration, so it feels like the world is very much in flux.
Yeah, pins and needles, sir. Pins and needles. It's a thriller to say the least. Now, how did you get into the business?
Well, I'm originally from Vancouver. I went to film school at NYU, and then moved out here to Los Angeles in 2002. I worked for Appian Way, which is Leonardo DiCaprio's production company, as an assistant. So I worked there. I'd done some internships before that when I was at NYU, and those really kind of laid the groundwork for me eventually getting my first assistant job. And then did that. Wanted to be a screenwriter at the time. While I was at NYU, I'd won this thing called the Sloan Foundation Fellowship, which is a scholarship for like science-based projects. And so I was like, I want to be a writer, but I want to work in feature development to understand what that is and all that kind of stuff. So I did that for 3 years, and then went and worked for a guy called Andrew Marlowe, who wrote Air Force One, Hollow Man, and End of Days at the time, and his wife Terry Miller, who's also a writer. And so I worked for them for a couple of years. Andrew created the TV show Castle. So I went on to work on Castle as the writer's assistant for the first 3 years. Oh, wow. And then while I was working on Castle, that really taught me a lot about structure and different writing techniques and process. And while I was there, a friend of mine was like, "Hey, do you ever thought about being a producer? Why don't you try being a producer?" And, I was kind of a lazy writer. I was really good at coming up with ideas, but I wasn't great at actually, executing them. And so I started doing that and realized I loved that even more than being a writer, was working with writers. And so I left Castle in 2010 to focus on Bellevue as a production company at the time. And so did the independent producing for 4 years. Got a bunch of scripts in the blacklist, got them set up at like Warner Brothers and Fox and New Line, but didn't really got a small $1 million found footage movie made, but nothing big, nothing I was, really making any money from. And so a guy that I worked with a lot called Ian Shore, who'd written a couple of the scripts we set up at Fox and at Warner Brothers and written the movie that we got made, was like, "I think you should be manager. I think you should be my manager." And so I shifted into management in 2015, brought on a colleague called Jeff Portnoy to work with me at Bellevue. That first year we had 3 scripts in the blacklist, which was great. Four scripts in the blacklist, actually. Nice. And we sold one of those to a company called Broadgreen, called another one to Focus Features. And then the next year, our client, Elyse Hollander, who's also my wife, actually, my client, Elyse Hollander, is also my wife, wrote a script called Blonde Ambition that was #1 on the blacklist, this kind of biopic of Madonna. And that kind of really launched the public profile of the company in a big way. And since then, we've added 2 more managers to the company, Zach Zucker and Kate Sharp. We've got a few more movies get made. Eli came out on Netflix last year, or I guess 2 years ago, 2019. And then, Infinite is scheduled to come out this year, although, it's everything's in flux with the release schedules right now. And I produced both of those movies. Just a lot of other clients. We had our client, Chris Thomas Devlin, had his movies Cobweb, and he also wrote the latest version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. So he's been quite successful. A lot of clients staffed on TV shows. A lot of kind of interesting stuff. My client's Kathy Charles had a couple movies that she's written, and so on and so forth. And Jeff and Zach and Kate and their clients have had a fair amount of success. So and then we had the #1 script in the blacklist back in 2020, a few weeks ago, with Sophie Dawson's Headhunter. Continue to have a good placing on the annual blacklist, especially for a relatively smaller company compared to kind of larger management behemoths, and get movies get made, get clients staffed, and discover new writers. Sophie was someone I found off of a query letter in August, and 4 months later she was the #1 writer on the blacklist. Really had good success in terms of finding people and helping launch young and up and coming writers.
It's funny because I was friends with John Hurtis, and I was at the Castle set once. He invited me over to Castle set year 1, and it was so much fun being on that set. But everybody was just like, we don't even know if we're going to get picked up. It was that whole first season energy that I
remember. Yeah, I remember. We were a summer show. We were a summer replacement. It was us and this Jeremy Renner show called The Unusuals, which was created by Noah Hawley, actually, of all people. Right. It was like kind of crazy. Yeah.
It was insane. And then, of course, it went on to like a decade of success. 8 seasons. Yeah, something like that. Now, there's a lot of young writers really don't understand what a manager does and the difference between a manager versus an agent. Can you just kind of give us a quick rundown on that?
Sure. Look, there's some technical issues. I would say the first point, #1, is that agents are licensed by the state and they cannot produce. Managers can produce, and they are not. There's no state license or anything like that. The way I kind of tend to think of it more, and honestly, every manager is different. And to be honest, there are some agents who are more involved than other agents. But on a generalized level, I would say that managers tend to be the kind of people who come on board early in a writer's career. More often than not, they find the writer and they bring them to representation and producers and stuff like that. Agents tend to be more the salespeople who, when they have something, they help sell that person or that script, when there is something to sell. So, I would say the manager helps you build the car. The agent goes out there and sells it. and then sells you essentially. Look, there are exceptions where the agent finds the person first, but I would say more often than not, the manager finds the person first and brings them to, an agency into larger representation. The manager is your consigliere. They're the person who kind of like advises you step by step on things, and helps you kind of create things. And the agent is more the person who's looking at the big picture. Can we sell this? How do we sell this? How do we get your name out there? So they kind of work in tandem, in the proper way. They work in tandem in a good way.
But some managers are grabbing writers early on and kind of like building careers and guiding them through the process to get prepared to work with an agent. Where I think a lot of writers automatically think they need an agent. Oh, if I had an agent, my whole world would change. And it's generally not like that, correct?
Yeah, it's funny that people think that, because it's kind of like, why would your life change if you don't have something to sell? Then they can't sell what there isn't to sell. It's like being like, oh man, if I only had a real estate broker, I could like make so much money. It's like, well, do you have a house? No. Well, then okay, that's nothing for a real estate broker to do. And so, yeah, I mean, like, look, there are exceptions, but more often than not, the manager is the person who finds someone early in their career, helps them kind of like, they're the consigliere. They're the person advising them every step of the way. They're the person getting the most of the phone calls, not the agent necessarily. The agent's the person when you have a big question or you have a scenario that requires their input. And the agent's also generally, not always, but more often than not, part of a larger, bigger company where there are actors and directors that you could package with, or certainly there's larger concerns, and they're just very much at the center of an information matrix where they're hearing all kinds of things and jobs and things like that and all that kind of stuff. Whereas managers, there is an element of that comes to it, and we certainly do hear about things, but agents there are agents at agencies. They don't really have any clients. They're called covering agents, and their entire job is to find out what different buyers around town are looking for,
Interesting. Now, when you're working with a young writer, do you like give them, like, obviously if they're in if you've accepted them as a client, or you've brought them into, or at least kept them, working with them to maybe prepare to be a client, what do you obviously you see some talent in there, but do you give them homework? Do you kind of like, hey, we need this, this, and this in order to take you to the next place? We need X amount of scripts, or like, how do you actually work with a young writer?
It depends on what I sign them off of. Sometimes I sign someone and I'm like, oh, this script is commercial. I know how to sell this. Honestly, not very often, but it does happen. I'm like, oh, I know how to sell this. This doesn't need a lot of work. So then I'm just going out there and we're selling it. We're trying to get it done, and we're trying to get them the next thing, But more often than not, I read a script and I'm like, this person's really talented, but I don't know that this is a script that they're going to make any money on, or that I can get in the blacklist, or I can get them meetings off of, or I can get them an agent off of. So in that case, more often than not, I'm saying, hey, I know you're talented. I want to hear your ideas. And if I like some of those ideas, or sometimes I'll bring an idea to you if I have the right idea, let's develop one of those, because I think that will be the thing that we can launch your career with, because I don't want to bring them to the marketplace. For what I'm looking for is a good writer, is a talented writer, and a driven writer, and a collaborative writer. Agents are looking for something they can sell, and producers looking for something they can make. And if what you have is not that, then it's very hard to get traction, unless it's like a super blacklisty, like really interesting script where people are like, oh, wow, the talent here just jumps off the page. This is so interesting. And even then it's like, okay, you're talented. What are you working on next? How do we slot you? How do we make money from you? That's the thing that I think sometimes gets tangled up with people. They're like, oh, well, I'm an artist. And it's like, that is true. There's an art to screenwriting, but inherently it is a job that you need to get paid for. I don't get paid until the client gets paid. I get 10%, but if there's no money coming in, then I'm paying 10% of nothing, So it is my goal to monetize people. And that's not a negative thing. It's like, I want you to get paid. You deserve to get paid. You deserve to be a full-time writer. Let's work towards making that a reality.
Yeah, there is that whole art versus commerce argument, and a lot of times when you're dealing with artists and filmmakers and screenwriters, they just want to be an artist, but unfortunately we're working in a very expensive medium.
It's rare to find someone who says that, who is established.
Exactly, that who's established. I'm talking about more younger, starting up. They're like, oh, I don't want to be tainted with the whole money thing. I just want to create. I'm like, well,
It's rare to find someone who says, I want to be tainted by the money thing who doesn't already have money.
Exactly. Very, very true. Now, you've mentioned the blacklist a few times. Can you explain to the audience the difference between there's two blacklists. There's the actual list and there's a website. Can you explain the difference between the two?
Yeah. So the Annual Blacklist existed for I don't know how many years, 15 years or something like that now. It was created by Franklin Leonard. And it's basically a list that not all, but a lot of executives in town vote on, and they vote for, and agents and managers cannot vote on it for obvious reasons. You would vote for your own clients, that you vote for the best unmade scripts of the year, essentially, each year. And then there is, Franklin later created this and kind of worked on it and perfected it, the Blacklist website where people can upload their scripts for a fee and then get feedback and things like that. And, representatives like myself, managers and agents, and I believe producers as well, can log in there and find scripts that are suiting what they're looking for. So that is different. But, I have found a lot of people from that Blacklist website who, I helped launch, we got them on staffed on TV shows. We, got this, that, I found scripts on there and writers on there who eventually ended up on the Annual Blacklist. So that is the difference between the two things. Now,
do you usually work more with television writers or with feature writers, and in which of the two where's there most opportunity in today's current marketplace?
It depends on the person,
Okay.
It's like I would say there's a lot more television opportunities than there are feature opportunities, but it's really, really hard to break into television because everyone's trying to do it right now. So it just depends on who they are and what their skill set is and what their interest level is. In a non-pandemic time, if you want to be a writer in television, you need to live in Los Angeles. Given the pandemic, people are keeping weird hours with writers' rooms. People are in Hawaii and they're working in a New York room and just keeping weird hours, but because it's all on Zoom at this point. But normally in non-pandemic times, you need to be in Los Angeles for the most part to be in a writer's room, There are sometimes rooms in New York, and obviously London has its own industry in other countries, but historically LA is that place. But as a feature writer, you don't have to live in LA. It'd be great if you did. It certainly would be better for your career if you did, but it's not a requirement necessarily. So that is one aspect of being a TV writer versus a feature writer. But yeah, it's just about who, I would say at this point it's kind of 50-50 for me. My background is more in features. That's kind of what I came up in. But I would say at this point, 50% of the income for my company is TV writers and getting people staffed on TV shows. And I signed a new TV writer right before the break in December, who is, just graduated from NYU, TV writer, had an amazing script. We just took him out to agents this week. We've already got an agency that wants to meet with him to sign him, So, that is an aspect of that, that we do, pretty regularly, and certainly is expanding as the TV landscape continues to expand.
Now, you mentioned that, there's our virtual writers' rooms now because of the COVID pandemic. Do you see that changing the way business is done? Because, I've spoken to so many agents and managers now, they're like, why am I jumping in a car and going on the 405 for an hour and a half to have a 30-minute meeting and then jump back in the car, come back an hour and a half? And it's like, why wouldn't I just do Zoom meetings? So I sense that there's a lot of change in how people are doing business in town. But do you think writers' rooms are also going to kind of shift? Obviously in-person writers' rooms are still going to be the norm, but is there going to be more opportunity for people who do live in Hawaii or might live in New York or do you think everyone's still going to be here?
No, a year from now, if the pandemic has subsided, it'll be about in-person writing rooms. That's like being like, do you think in-person dating will go away? Yeah, you'd like to Zoom to start off with, but you're not going to be like, yeah, so we've never met. We just Zoom all the time. It's just not the same. People want to be in a room and you just get better content and things move. I think people miss being in the writer's room. They really do. I think so. I don't think that's going anywhere. I think, look, Zooms are cool and all. But I've signed clients I've never met in person, but I can't see a situation where if someone lived in Los Angeles, I wouldn't want to meet them in person. And in-person meetings are always going to be better than Zoom meetings or phone calls. They just are,
Mm-hmm.
And so given the option, people, depending on the circumstance, will more often than not aim for. Here's what I would say. If I'm doing a pitch or if I'm going up for a job and I'm a writer, I lived in Los Angeles and the job was in Los Angeles, I would always advocate to have an in-person meeting over a Zoom meeting. Like I would just think that's what they would want, and that's what I would want from my clients, because you just have a better chance of connecting with the person. And that's half of what the whole job is like them connecting with your take, but them also connecting with you and being like, you're the person who can get this thing done.
Now, I'm assuming you're approached by writers daily about getting representation. Yeah. Like as we're probably talking, you've probably been hit 3 or 4 emails already. So you're always constantly getting approached by writers for representation. How should a writer not approach a manager for representation?
Don't show up to my office when I'm in my office. I mean, that happens. It has happened most times. Yeah.
Really?
Don't send mail, don't send letters, which doesn't really happen as much as it used to, but you don't need to send letters. I'm pretty active on Twitter, and I have a pretty specific query letter thread that I put up. I actually put up if you go to my Twitter profile, which is my first and last name, John Zaozirny, all one word on Twitter, my pinned tweet is a link to, all my kind of best threads, my best Twitter threads that have been compiled into a PDF document that anyone can download and read for free. And one of those is a pretty specific query letter thread about how to do it. And the answer is just to do it really. Email is the best. Don't phone call. Definitely don't text message. All these things have happened to me. No one's ever shown up to my home address, thank God. I've gotten phone calls. I've gotten I've gotten tweets as well, but I've gotten texts, don't like any of those. It's really simple. Just email, people, make it really simple. Put the subject of your name of your script or whatever in the subject line. Hey, John, maybe a bit about why you think I'm the right person. Hey, I write music biopics similar to one of your clients, Elyse Hollander, or horror movies similar to Chris Thomas Devlin, David Chirchirillo, or Kathy Charles, or whoever, Here's my log line. Write your log line out. Hope you like it. The end. No attachments, nothing, and just keep it really simple. And then, and I respond, a lot to people. I won't respond if I don't like it. That puts me in a legally tricky position, which some people seem unable to realize. They're like, why don't you respond to why don't you like as if they're owed some kind of a response, no one feels they need to respond to junk mail, but somehow anyways. But if I respond, and I often do respond, I think, as I mentioned, I found the #1 Blacklist script this year via query email in August. So like, really? And the client that I just signed in December and starting to meet with TV agents, I found him through an unsolicited query email that I got in December. I have a client whose short film is playing Sundance in a couple of weeks, and he reached out to me via query email. So like. I definitely pay attention to query emails, but that said, I probably get, especially since I let people know that I found the #1 Blacklist person through the query email, I probably get at this point like 30 or 40. I used to get 20 a day, but now I probably get more like 30 or 40 a day. And most of them do not follow the rules. Most of them have attachments. Most of them multiple log lines. I get a lot of emails that are like, excuse me, I would like to be rep by you. Thank you. And there's no log line. There's not, or like, hi, I'd like to get the phone with someone and get some advice, please.
I literally get those emails on a daily basis.
Yeah, you know how it is.
I mean, they just send me out. They're like, hey, here's my project. I'm like, why are you sending? You've obviously done no homework. I have no power to help you. Why are you sending me your script? Why are you sending me? Like, I don't respond to them and that's another good question. Like, how do you deal with unsolicited scripts? Because it does put you in a legally, precarious situation.
I delete them. It's pretty simple. I delete them, the way that it works is someone sends me a log line, in a query email in a respectful fashion. If I like it, I email them back and say, here's a release form. Please fill out the release form and email it back to me with your screenplay. And then if they send it to me with a release form, which, 99.9% they do, once in a while they're like, I'm not signing a release form, in which case I'm not reading your screenplay. But, it's only happened a handful of times, and then they fill out the release form. And if I like it, then, great. If it's not, then I pass, usually I try to do it within 2 weeks, at least 2 to 3 weeks, So, and more often, you know, most often I pass because, you know, I've got to be picky. But when I like it, then I engage with the person, I have a conversation and see whether or not they're the right person for me, you know, and I'm the right person for them.
Fair enough. Now, are there any Hollywood myths you'd like to debunk for writers? Because there's a lot of those kind of, like we were talking about, like all I need is an agent and my life will change. Are there any kind of those myths that you like to debunk for writers?
You know, I guess I'm trying to think. That's a good question. I would say like that it's worth doing anything to get into the town, like that showing up in person, that like being aggressive, being obnoxious, that people respect that, you know, people remember that, you know, it's better to be polite. You know, it's like, it's just a way to be, you know, treat other people as you would like to be treated. If you were in our situation, I think be respectful, be humble, be polite, you know, don't badger, I would say. You know, people are like I told a story on Twitter about how when I was an intern, someone snuck into my boss's office at Village Roadshow and put a screenplay on her desk. And she felt really violated and they probably thought it was a cute Hollywood story, but what it was a person who was selfish and borderline criminal, you know? And so I think that's definitely, you know, it's not all about, you know, getting, and people don't respect the hustle in that sense. That's not a hustle. That's just being impolite and rude and, you know, lots of other, you know, not great stuff. So I would say that's the first thing. You know, people are also obsessed with this idea that like the blacklist is, you know, this or, you know, or people are like everything is a scam or everything is, if people, you know, I see a lot of people, really bitter people on Twitter and Reddit who are like, I've written 5 screenplays and none of them have sold. This whole thing's a racket. And it's like, no, it's just, you know, that's how it is. And I think when things don't work, instead of being like, oh, this industry sucks, be like, why are people not responding to what I'm doing? You know, why, what is it about the thing I'm putting into the world that is, I think people are more open to look out the world and be like, this world is wrong or this industry is wrong, than be like, okay, what's the difference between the things that are selling and my thing, and be really honest about it. You know, like, when I was a producer, you know, I had some success, but I didn't have a huge amount of success. And when I was a writer, I never sold anything, you know, like, and I wasn't like, this whole thing's a racket. I was like, okay, well, maybe this isn't the right job for me. Maybe this is not where my skill sets lie. And really being truthful and honest about that and being like, how do I change? How do I evolve? You know? And I think people, unfortunately, can be very blinded by the idea of like, you know, success. And, you know, if they don't get the success, then they feel like, oh, well, everything's cheated. It's lies, you know. And so that's the thing I would say is like, look inside and look at your work and be, you know, ruthless is maybe the wrong word, but be really look inside yourself, be like, why are things not working and how do I adjust that? And that's the mark of a professional, you know. That's the mark of someone, you know, who's taking this seriously, is looking at it and adjusting, you know, what they're doing. You know, what's that old line, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Well, you know, look at it and be like, okay, how do I adjust? How do I change what I'm doing? How do I evolve as a writer? Because clearly what's working, what I'm trying right now isn't working, you know?
Now, there's a myth, and it's not a myth because I think it does happen, but is more rare than anything, is the theft of ideas, the theft of a script, you know, and things like that. And I've spoken to anytime I've spoken to filmmakers or screenwriters, and sometimes they like, before I talk to you, I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement about this script idea.
People are professionals, right? They're like,
they're not.
People never made $1 in their life. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah, they're not high-end professionals, because I mean, I've dealt with high-end professionals in our business, and no, it just doesn't work that way. Can you kind of debunk that and kind of, because I mean, but I've also heard horror stories. I mean, it does happen, but it's so rare, and it's maybe, and is it true? I don't know.
Like when it happens, it's more like, I wrote this treatment for free for this producer, and then they like didn't pay me the money, but I never had a legal agreement with me, which is a totally different thing, right?
Completely.
That's
yes.
like, yeah, no, I mean, look, it doesn't happen that often, because the reality is, if you wrote a screenplay about something, why would I be like, great, this is a great idea, I'm going to go spend 6 to 9 months with a different writer to try and get a different, like, it doesn't make any sense from a logical point of view, you know? I think more often than not, You know, like I wrote this, one of the first successes I had was working with Ian Shore on a screenplay about the Count of Monte Cristo. You know, it was an adaptation of the Count of Monte Cristo, public domain book, you know, and another screenplay about the Count of Monte Cristo, completely different take, a kind of modern day take. We had a sci-fi take, came out like 2 weeks before our spec did, and we were like, oh no. But they didn't steal our idea. The Count of Monte Cristo is out there in the world, you know. Right. I have a script with Jack the Ripper that was on the blacklist recently. Someone else could have written. I was honestly surprised nobody did the take on Jack the Ripper that we took. You know, nobody had written it and gone to market, to my knowledge. You know, with anything like that. So it's like when you're working on something like that, you know, you know, like there were 2 movies with volcanoes that came out the same fucking year in Hollywood. You know, like.
Oh yeah, don't forget Armageddon, Deep Impact. I mean, it happens.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, so like. You know, what I do tell people to do is if you're working with a producer, make sure as soon as possible you have a lawyer draw up something that protects your legal rights, and an entertainment attorney, you know, like who not just you're like, I had one person like, oh, we have my family attorney's drawing this up, who does real estate. And I'm like, that's crazy. That's like being like, I'm going to have my podiatrist do my heart surgery because I know him.
Because they both went to medical school. So that's logic.
Obviously. So, you know, it's like act like if you want to be treated professionally, then act like a professional. And so, yeah, the horror stories you hear are I wrote a screenplay on a verbal agreement at best. And you know, and then these people didn't pay me the money I deserved, or this happened or that happened. And look, that's not to say there aren't shitty people in the industry. There absolutely are. But that's why you have to be smart about these things. And people like I was on Twitter couple days ago, like a week ago, and there was some anonymous film producer. Literally, the name of his Twitter account was anonymous or mystery or something like that, mystery film producer. And I was like, who is this person? He was like taking ideas. People were sending him like treatments and screenplays.
Oh my
and,
God.
It was crazy. And I was like, this doesn't sound like – he was like, I've given this – how do I change someone's life by I read their screenplay and then I give it to another producer and then that production company is making it. I was like, but no producer would ever do that. Why would a producer give a screenplay to another producer? They want the screenplay for themselves. Obviously. That's like me being like, oh man, my good deed today was I got someone else a manager at a different company. Like, by the way, I've done that once in a while. Like, but it's not like I'm like bragging because like my job is to manage people, right? Like, why am I advocating for other people? So I was like, well, this is kind of weird. This is kind of sketchy. And I pointed that out, and then the person was like, blah, blah, blah. Actually, it's a mystery who I am. But I had gotten information from someone else that they were posing as a famous producer called Trip Vincent. They said secretly that this was their name to other people. And I was like, no, you're not. And I know Trip Vincent's company. So I called them and I'm like, this is not Trip. They're like, no, it's not Trip. So I was like, yo, you're not Trip Vincent. And he just deleted his account, whoever it was, right?
Wow.
But like my point being, there were a bunch of people who were kind of mad at me or half mad at me because they were sending this person stuff. And like this one account was like, I've talked with him. He's for real. He's a retired producer in his 60s and 70s who's rich and just wants to help people. And I was like, dude, you don't know any producers because that's not how they are, right? Like you can be like 90 years old and you're like, no one retires. Like producers don't retire. They're in it till they like Robert Evans wasn't like, oh, I'm just retired and like looking on Twitter for people to help when he was alive. Like that's not what he's like. I'm still a producer. I'm still making things, you know? Mm-hmm. And so like people were sending this random fake ass account like their treatments, and because they were like, this one person was like, we just want to hope, you know, we just want to believe anyone who says that they can help us. We just want to believe them. And it's like that's like being like, I got this email and this person says they're a prince and I just need to give them $5,000 to get rich. And it's like, okay, I'm going to blame you for not doing if you get ripped off by your friend or your family member, that's awful. If you get ripped off by someone that's an obvious internet scam, then like, I understand what you did it, but I can't sit here and be like, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, be a professional, you know, act with due diligence. And
then of course they get angry at you for squashing their hope.
They kind of did. I mean, some people kind of semi did, but they were also just like, it's crazy because the same people, by the way, who'd be like, oh my God, they stole my idea, are sending their screenplays and treatments to someone and loglines to someone who they don't even know the name of. So if that person was real, they could go turn around and and take that treatment or take that script and do their own version of it theoretically, which by the way, they wouldn't because it takes too much time. But if they were to do it, you would never be able to prove that this producer stole your idea because they never gave you a name.
It's an anonymous name.
Right. You're like, well, you give it to a mystery account. That's not me. Like, So it's just this weird thing where the same people who sometimes are super obsessed with no one stealing their ideas are also the people who are doing the least due diligence about anything, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So
now, when you're looking to sign a new screenwriter, is there anything you're looking for specifically in them as far as work ethic, as far as amounts of scripts or writing samples? Like, what are you looking for?
You know, it's funny because some people, I was seeing another manager talk, and she said what I think is most people say, which is, we want 2 screenplays, which I guess is to prove that like you're not like you didn't like hit it rich with one.
Right.
I'm the exception. I sign people off of 1 screenplay. I don't like. It's funny, like this is gonna make some people crazy, but my wife, Elyse Hollander, when she wrote Blonde Ambition, that was the first feature-length script she'd ever written. You know,
wow, that's insane.
So it worked out quite nicely. You know, and but I knew I wanted to sign Sophie Dawson off of HEADHUNTER. She gave me a couple other scripts she'd written, and they were fantastic as well, but I didn't need them. You know, she just wanted to send them to me so I was aware of them, you know. I think if you can do it once, you can do it again, you know. That's my feeling. Certainly with my guidance and help, we can do that, you know. So I don't need like 4 screenplays. And nobody really – it's rare for people to ask for a second sample. It happens. But it's not that – it doesn't happen that often. I remember when people were like – when Elyse was number 1 on the blacklist, they're like, oh, well, what else can we read of hers? I'm like, that's it. That's what you got. If that's not good enough, I don't know what to tell you, you know. So, you know, there are some people out there who are like that, and I'm probably the exception in terms of managers, but that's where I'm at. But what I'm looking for people, other than having one great script, at least one great script, is drive. I'm looking for that person to be serious about what they're doing and not for it to be a hobby. I'm looking for them to really want to be doing this as their profession because, you know, I get paid when they get paid. And if they're just like a hobby, then like, what's the point of me it's not a hobby for me, you know? And then another thing is kind of attitude and collaborative attitude. I'm looking for someone, the industry, especially for screenwriters, is very much about collaboration and working with executives and producers and, you know, agents and managers, and actors and all that kind of stuff. And so it's very much about, you know, is this someone who, if they got on a Zoom or got in a room with a person or a phone call, that other people would want to work with this person, you know? And making sure that that's the case, because if they're standoffish, if they're rude, if they're obstinate, then like that's going to be hard for me. If I can't stand them, then it's going to be hard for executives to give them money, you know, because when you're working with someone on a project, if it's a feature, it could be, you know, 6-9 months, could be years. If it's a TV show, you're going to be in the same room with this person from like 10 o'clock to like in the morning to like 10 o'clock at night sometimes, you know, so you better really like that person. So, you know, being collaborative and having a good attitude about collaboration is very, very important being a screenwriter. It often gets overlooked. People think of the Charlie Kaufman model of someone typing alone in a room and here's my genius and you just make me some money. But that is very rare. That is very much the exception, you know?
Yeah, there's not many Charlie Kaufmans around Hollywood.
No.
There's not even another one. There's only one Charlie Kaufman, like there's only one Tarantino and one Aaron Sorkin.
Charlie, he would be like, "Oh, it's been a super smooth ride." You know?
I know since he shifted to directing. I mean, I've heard stories of him. He's just trying to finance his films, and it's just taking, like, if Charlie Kaufman's not able to get financing for his films with his scripts, you know, and people are complaining.
People are like, I want to be Charlie Kaufman. I'm like, oh, did you watch his last 2 or 3 movies? Oh, no, they were too weird for me. Well, there you go.
No, and I'm assuming that you've probably also – well, let me ask you the question. Have you ever turned down a client who was insanely talented, but you just saw that, like, I can't work with them or her, or I know that there's going to be trouble down the line with executives or, like, you know, because a lot of people think, oh, it's talent. And it's – talent is a part of it. In my opinion, talent is a part of it. But all those things that you just said arguably could even be a little bit bigger than talent sometimes.
I mean, we've gone separate ways sometimes, you know. I mean, I wouldn't say there's anyone who may have been like, oh, my God, this person's God-level talented, you know. Because, like, it's rare that you meet – being collaborative and having a good attitude – you know, like, I think my wife is obviously an immensely talented writer, but I think she's also one of the reasons she's had a great deal of success has been that she actually worked at a studio for an executive as an assistant. Then she also worked for a director for Hunter Gonzalez Inarritu, and she also worked at a management company, and she also worked on a TV show. And so when she's talking to showrunners and when she's talking to executives or when she's talking to directors, she used to work very closely with all those people, not like that person, but she's worked for a director, she's worked for an executive. And so she knows, especially with studios, she knows how to speak studios, she knows how to speak executive. And that is a huge part of it, I think that is, if it was someone, it'd be rare to find someone who's so amazingly writing, their writing talent is here and their collaborative ability is so here, and they're like, oh my God, they're so great. Because those things just don't tend to go together that often, they just don't. And I mean, that's why we're like, oh, there's Charlie Kaufman, and then there's not really a lot of other people. I mean, I think Richard Kelly's a very talented person. He hasn't made a movie since The Box. It's been at least almost 10 years. And I know that some people, when they developed with him, he could write a completely different script than the script that they paid him for, And I mean, I always heard people respected him and liked him, but I think he was very much an artist. And I think it can be hard for people like that to, especially if their movies are not financially successful, to continue with their careers. So, I mean, I've had issues with clients. I wouldn't say they were like God level talented, but where they were talented, but they, I mean, a lot of what happens is, what I do is I'm very much involved in development and I'm bringing something to the table. And when people keep ignoring, I'm kind of like, well, what's my add value to you? Like, if you keep ignoring me, and then sometimes what people think they want is they want to manage. What they really want is actually just a second agent. Do you know what I'm saying? Who's like, this is great, we're going to take this out, and that's not what I do. So, there have been times, but it doesn't happen that often. More often than not, when I meet someone, I'm pretty clear about how I operate and what I'm looking for. And those people who are like that, they just tend to go with a different manager, or they tend not to want to sign with me, or I tend not to want to sign them, because, they're going to want to do their thing. And, we can kind of see the car crash coming down the road,
Now, do you produce most of your clients' work, or is that just specific things? How does that work?
I have a really specific rule, which is if it's my idea, like my original idea. So like Eli was based on an original idea that I had, which was, to be fair, it was even before I was a manager. I started working with David Churchirillo when I was just a producer, and then I became a manager, and eventually he left his manager and signed with me. But originally my idea was, what if, a boy with an autoimmune disorder was in a haunted house? And so I brought that to David, and he brought the kind of the twist ending to it, which is so great now, which gives like a Sixth Sense kind of vibe to it. He brought that whole element to it, which really elevated it. But that was the original idea that I brought. And that was even when I was just a producer, so that's kind of a weird example to give. But Blonde Ambition, that was an idea that I brought to Elyse because it was a story that I'd heard when I was at NYU. Jelly Bean Benitez literally came into my class and talked about his relationship with Madonna. So I knew that story. But like Infinite, that was a book that, that was brought to me by Raffi Crone, and then I optioned it, and Raffi came on as an executive producer, and I came as producer, and we brought it to Ian Shore, who spec'd it, and so, it's so like my client, Chris Thomas Devlin, his scripts Cobweb or Video Nasty, I helped develop those in terms of I gave notes on it, but those were his original ideas, so I'm not producing those, Whereas like Ripper, which was just on the Blacklist and which we're doing with Atlas, that was original idea on Jack the Ripper that I brought to Dennis McGee Fallon, who's a client of mine and Zach's. And I was like, hey, here's a take on Ripper. And he really liked that take and had his own kind of additions to it, but it's pretty simple. Like I don't really have any issues on that thing because, usually it's very clear where I came in on the process.
Now, how is the pandemic really affecting your clients on what they do? Because essentially, writers just write in a room anyway, isolated, generally speaking, for features at least.
Affecting the sense that, like, a lot of studios, they can't. I mean, there's no market for theatrically released movies right now. Not really, Right. And so there's not as much money coming in. There just isn't. So when there's not as much money coming in, they're not buying as many movies and they're not making as many movies. They just aren't. So I would say production is at least operating at 50% capacity. It might be below that, and so there's just less jobs out there. Less jobs.
But how about the streaming, like Netflix and Hulu and these other streaming services?
So when you're making a movie during a pandemic, how much do you, let's say you're making, let's say you're making like a TV show, and the budget for the TV show is, let's say $100 million, right? For like, I don't know, 10 or 12 episodes, right? Mm-hmm. That's probably inflated, but like, let's just call it that because it's a round number. What do you think percentage on top of the $100 million do you think you have to do in terms of you can't shoot as many days, you can't keep as long hours, you have to clean things all the time, you have to do pandemic testing? What do you think that adds to a $100 million budget?
I've estimated about 15%.
Right, so $50 million. So given that now that things cost $115 million, not $100 million, that would necessarily cut down the number of things you make, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
So there you go.
There's across the board, all content.
Yeah. I mean, look, that's why there's not like a fourth season or third season of Glow, you know, because they looked at the numbers and they're like, this doesn't make sense, you know. That's why they're just making – also, insurance is very hard to get by for a lot of movies, you know, because there's just no insurance. The people will not insure against a coronavirus shutdown. Because if there's a coronavirus shutdown, like say like, and I don't have any inside information on this, but I remember hearing that Don't Worry Darling got shut down for 2 weeks. They still have to pay the crew for those 2 weeks. They still have to keep the locations. They have to keep paying for the equipment. You know,
housing, food.
So you're adding on another, and that's when that's coronavirus stuff that you didn't plan for in the budget. You know, so
yeah, that's why
it's a lot harder to make movies because there's less factors involved. You know,
that's why Tom Cruise lost his mind, and rightly so.
I do not disagree with that. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, when I heard, and everyone was like, a lot of people were like bashing him. I'm like, are you kidding me? I completely 100% agree with how, you know, what he said.
People who don't tend to work. I mean, some people did. Some people like, you can't talk that way to anybody. But I'm like,
no.
I mean, I don't think Tom would say that was his finest moment. But I think also the idea of like the amount of stress that he must be under, everyone must be under.
Yeah,
it's like,
and it already shut down.
Used to go back up, you know, and they really did allow people to like believe like, oh, we get Tom and is doing this, and I think we can figure out a way to do this, you know.
Right, and it already had shut down once, you know, so that was a lot.
More than once, actually.
Yeah, so, I mean, and that's such a high-profile project and all that kind of stuff, but absolutely right. And people don't think about that. Like, if you shut down 2 weeks, that's production. And the thing is that extra cost is not going on the screen. That's just cost of doing business has gone up 15%.
Yeah.
Which is insane, which is absolutely insane. Now, I'm going to ask you a few questions I ask all of my guests. What are 3 screenplays every screenwriter should read?
That's a good one. I get asked that one often. And I you know, the first one that always comes to mind for me is Michael Clayton. I'm a huge Tony Gilroy fan. And I think Michael Clayton's really fantastic. Trying to think what else. I know, well, this is cheating because this is one of my best friends, but my buddy Will Bell is a great writer. If you have a chance to read any of his stuff, particularly Gangster Squad, I think that's a great script. Also, I should cover for any of my clients listening to this. I'm making a rule, which is I'm not going to recommend any Bellevue client scripts. That's why there's no Bellevue client scripts in here. Trying to think. I mean, I don't know. I'm going to go back to the classics and be like, read a Bill Goldman screenplay. You know, read Princess Bride, or read why am I blanking? Butch Cassidy.
Butch, right.
All the President's Men, you know, which I would say the people that I just described. I mean, I think Tony Gilroy would describe himself as a student of Bill Goldman, and I would say Will very much is in the vein of Bill Goldman with, you know, some Shane Black and some style like that. So that's certainly a style that I personally really vibe with. So you know, I feel bad because I don't really think about that a lot. I'm more like if I have a client who's working a certain realm, I'm like, I'll recommend like, oh, you should check this script out, you should check that script out. So I don't really usually give blanket kind of statements. I'm more interested in and also all the scripts I just mentioned, they're very much about the scripts, not necessarily the movie. Do you know what I'm saying? It's about the screenplay and how it flows on the page and the interesting tricks that people pull off and the insights that they have and things like that. So those are just scripts. I mean, Will's a buddy of mine, and I remember reading Gangster Squad when he was writing it, so there's a personal attachment to me. Michael Clayton was one of the scripts I read when I was an assistant, you know, in Hollywood. And I remember reading that being like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then obviously Bill Goldman, that's someone I read in college, you know? So there's so many great writers out there, and I'm going to probably be mad that I didn't mention some of them when I get off this podcast. But I honestly, when I talk to clients and they have a new project, I'm like, oh, you should read, like, we have a new client that's doing a supernatural thriller. So I was recommending them to like, okay, I want you to read Get Out. I want you to read Us. I want you to read, you know, there's a great script called Bed Rest, you know, all these scripts that are in the vein of what you're dealing with. I want you to look at how they create mood and atmosphere, and I think a lot of great horror films, especially supernatural thrillers, start off as character movies before evolving into more overtly supernatural. So like Rosemary's Baby could really just be about a woman dealing with a difficult pregnancy and a husband who is kind of not paying attention to her, and then it evolves into something larger. And so that's a lot of what I talk about, is like looking at a Noah Baumbach film or a Cassavetes film and being like, that's how your first act should feel. And then after the first act, it starts to ramp up, really.
Now, really quickly, can you give people a reality check? Because in regards to, they think that just because they have an amazing script that it's going to turn into a movie or into a series, where I'm sure you have read hundreds of amazing scripts that have yet to be produced for one reason or another. Can you tell people the reality of what, because I've read some scripts, I'm like, this is an Oscar winner. Like, why has this not been produced? I'm sure you've read hundreds of things like that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I would say it's rare that I'm like, oh, I have no idea why this movie has never been made. Usually I have some idea of why it hasn't been made. There's a great script called The Burial that Doug Wright wrote. And I read it, when I was in college. And it's about, it's based on the true story of this funeral home that sounds so boring, but true story of a funeral home that got bought out by this Canadian chain, which lied to them essentially. And this really flashy African-American lawyer comes in and kind of saves the day. And I was just like, this is the greatest script I've ever read. But then I'm also like, it's as I pitched it to you, I felt myself getting bored. I'm like, it's a funeral home movie. Are you serious? But so I'm not super surprised that hasn't gotten made, but it's an amazing script. It's a script I go back to and I think about a lot, honestly. So I'm rarely surprised that something hasn't been made, honestly. I mean, sometimes there's stuff I've been involved in. I'm like, well, that seems like a slam dunk, but there's always politics and circumstances around these things. But I think I would actually, I'm gonna slide around your question a little bit and be like, all these people are like, I've had an amazing script. It's a surefire thing. Yeah. I'll give you an example of pilot season. Okay. In a normal pilot season, 30 to 40 pilots are ordered to series. I'm going to back up. 40 to 50 scripts are ordered from various writers. Of those, about 50% or less, let's say 20 of those, are actually ordered. Probably not even 20, honestly. Probably more like 15. Of those 50, 15 of those scripts ended up being shot as pilots. Okay? Of those 15, maybe 6 to 7 of those end up going to series. Of those series, the number of series that survive into a second season is probably 2 to 3 at best, And then of those 2 to 3, what goes on to have multiple seasons? Maybe 1. I remember Castle, the year that it was a pilot. I don't think there was a single other show that was a pilot the same year at that network that ended up surviving 8 seasons. That's the exception. That's really the exception. And I think that's a good example. On features, it's sometimes even harder, And so I think, but I would go even further. I'd be like, you got to look at your material and be like, look, why is this so surefire? Why is this? People are like, well, it's really similar to this other thing. And I'm like, well, that's not a really positive thing to say about your script, The reason movies get made, and I think Bill Goldman talks about this, is either because a movie star wants to do it, so it's like a total actor bait, amazing thing, or it's because a studio sees a franchise in it, and that's usually IP or something like that, right? And that's the reasons movies get made. And if your script doesn't have either of those or doesn't feel special enough, or I think people have to be very, very realistic about the stuff they're working on. It's easy for me to do that because I've been on this business for 20 years now, and I can I've seen things come and I've seen things go. I just think people have to be really look at their material and be like, is this good enough? It's certainly a question I ask myself all the way through the development process whenever I'm working on anything. Is this good enough? Is this going to make an impact in the marketplace? Is this going to make – because I always hear people say this phrase and they're so wrong. They're like, just need one person to say yes. Just need one person to say yes. It's the opposite. You don't need one person to say yes. You need 20 people to say yes. You need the CE to say yes. You need the VP to say – sorry, I'm going to back up. You need – the producer to say, the CE at the production company to say yes, the VP of the production company says yes, the head of the production company to say yes, and then you need the CE, the studio to say yes, the VP of the studio yes, the president of the studio to say yes, the CEO, overseer of the fucking whole
conglomerate
corporation to say yes. Then there's also a green light board that's to say yes. Before you even got to that point, you need a director to say yes. You need a bunch of actors to say yes. You need the production division of the studio to say yes. You need marketing to say yes, that we can actually market this, that we know how to market this. By the way, you need more than just one person in marketing because sometimes they fight over it. You need distribution to say yes. Like, people have no clue, and they're like, well, I'm going to make my thing made by a billionaire sometime, or whatever. Like, so many people have to say yes. It really is one of those things that it evolves, and I've seen a lot of scripts go yes, 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 and then there's a no. Like, I had a script that was at a big studio, I won't name it. They literally bought this script, okay? They bought this script, they paid for a rewrite on it, and then they went to the head of the studio, and the head of the studio was like, what's the concept? Oh yeah, I don't believe that. Okay, they bought it and they never told him what the log line was. And when they told him the log line, he just didn't believe it. And like, that was it. The script was dead after they bought it and paid for a rewrite.
Wow. And that's Hollywood. So, like, but that's a system.
Happens. It happens, and so like, all these things, you really have to be like, this has to like, and also scripts can die for weird reasons. Like that script should have been made in the sense that it was done for a reasonable number. I personally think it ended up at the wrong place, but I didn't have any control of that at that point. But like, I think it could have been made by a financier and done separately. But now there's so much money against it. It's at a studio that you can't pull it out of there, because studios would rather sit on something than have someone else make it and embarrass them. And they'll be like, well, we'll give it to you, but you have to pay us $1 million. And you're like, but the whole thing only cost X amount of money. They're like, yeah, we're tacking on overhead and interest. And we're also going to add in all these development costs for the companies that were involved, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And they're like, okay, well, then we can't do, this movie, $1 million against this movie is going to screw it up, because the movie shouldn't. It's $1 million that like it just sits in the budget. It doesn't actually do anything.
Yeah, I think that was a problem with the remake of Superman. By the time they made Man of Steel, it was hindered by obscene amounts of development from a decade or so prior. Was it Man of Steel? It wasn't Man of Steel. Superman Returns. Was it Superman? I think it was Superman Returns.
I don't think that had any personal impact on it personally.
But I remember that movie cost a whole lot. Like I had a friend of mine working.
Yeah, but like, who cares? Because that's a studio. I'm talking more like a $10 million horror movie or something.
Sure, of course.
$500 million in cost.
It hurts more.
I don't think the cost of Superman Returns is the reason it doesn't succeed. And not to be completely dismissive, but like, it's not that they were like, oh, Bryan Singer, sorry, man, you can't have that special effect because we paid $2 million for J.J. Abrams' script a while back. Like, it doesn't work. I mean, it makes it harder for Warner Brothers, certainly, but like, that's their own problem. I'm talking more like, oh, they're, a studio spent, $80,000 on a script, but then now they're claiming that it add up to $500,000 in costs. But the movie should get made for $3 million. And so if you have $500,000 in dead money, then like, no one's going to make it. So now the budget's gone to 3.5, and that 0.5, it's never going to show up on the screen.
Right. Exactly. So it makes it a lot harder to get out the block. And on top of that, the politics of being embarrassed by another, it being a hit or something.
They'd rather sit on it than be embarrassed.
Fair enough. What advice would you give a screenwriter wanting to break into the business? I'm sure you get that question constantly.
I mean, it really depends where they're at in their career. I would just say, watch movies. If you want, well, I would say, if you want to be a TV writer, or a feature writer, choose which lane you want to focus on first. If it's TV or it's features, whichever one it is, watch a bunch of that, read a bunch of that. Write a bunch of that. A lot of people I talk to, like, I'm like, they're like, oh no, right, I want to be a TV editor. What are your famous few shows? Why don't watch a lot of TV? Okay, well then maybe you shouldn't work in TV then. What have you read that you like? Well, I don't really read that much. I just do my own thing. Okay, it's just it's a bit of sheer arrogance sometimes. So, do the homework, treat it professionally. Like, if I was going to be like, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, well, I build cars. Oh, cool. Do you like drive cars? Do you like watch cars, like at races or whatever? Oh no, I don't do any of that. I just do that. Be like, that's a crazy person right there. But people act that way about screenplays and writing. They're like, oh, I just do my own thing. I don't pay attention to what's going on. I think you can't be guided by like, oh, well, this is that. But you certainly want to be aware of what's going on out there. And, you want to be aware of things. And also that will shape your expectations in the sense that if you're like, like people are like, I'm renting a Western. It's $100 million Western. I'm like, well, they don't really make Westerns anymore. They're like, well, I don't pay attention to that. I don't pay attention to trends. And I'm like, okay, well, don't be, who does? Executives, So like, I get that people want to do their own thing, and some cool stuff have come out of that. Absolutely. When people have kind of like done their own thing, but you should be aware of them. So you're not surprised when maybe things don't necessarily go the way you're hoping.
But don't you also find that there's so many writers and filmmakers hold on to the anomalies of our business, and they go, oh, well, that's going to be me. So like, how many found footage horror movies, when you see a business proposal, you're like, it's just like Blair Witch and Paranormal Activity. I'm like, you're talking about two of the biggest anomalies in the past 20, 30 years. I mean,
as someone who took out a found footage movie, I get that. But I missed the market. We made one, and we had another one that Ian Shore had written, and we missed the market essentially. Mm-hmm. It happens. I mean, look, the reality is, I don't want to tell people don't write the thing you're passionate about. I mean, there's a great on my tweet said there's a great Chris McQuarrie quote where he's like, I would never tell people not to write something they're not passionate about, but don't be surprised if no one else has any interest in it, because their job is to get movies made. It's not to like do passion projects, And so if your passion project lines up with their passion and an A-list movie star's passion and a director's passion, then things can work nicely. I have a call after this with a client, and we're working on this period biopic, which normally I would tell people don't do, but It's about something that I think will have a great I don't think it's something that the market is looking for necessarily, but I think it'll have a great resonance for A-list directors and A-list movie stars, because they'll be aware of this person and want to. And so like, I'm like, you know what? I think let's do this thing, because I think I see a way to getting it done. I see a way where an A-list movie star and A-list director is like, this is an important story that I want to tell and I want to explore, So
fair enough. And then what's the best place where people can find you?
I would say my Twitter account, which I've kind of referenced a few times, which is twitter.com, John Zaozirny, all one word. So I tweet pretty often on that one. And I also have my pinned tweet, as I referenced, has like a link, goes to a link where there's a compilation of all my best threads, and I update it every 3 or 4 months with those threads so that people can have it all in one place, and it's free, and I don't charge any money or anything like that. And if people have questions, they can just tweet at me, and if I can, I will answer them.
My friend, I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to the tribe, man. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I want to thank John for coming on the show and dropping his knowledge bombs on the Bulletproof Screenwriting Tribe. Thank you so much, John. If you want to get links to anything in this episode, including how to get a hold of John, head over to the show notes at bulletproofscreenwriting.tv/103. And guys, don't forget that we are doing our Indie Film Hustle Academy New Year's sale with up to 70% off amazing high quality screenwriting and filmmaking courses. Head over to ifhacademy.com. Thank you so much for listening, guys. As always, keep on writing, no matter what. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Bulletproof Screenwriting Podcast at bulletproofscreenwriting.tv.